Sometimes the cruelest wounds come wrapped in legal documents and sealed with a notary's stamp. That was the truth that shattered my world when I sat in that mahogany-lined law office, staring at my father's will that declared in cold, precise lettering, "To my daughter Sarah Mitchell I leave the sum of $0 I'm Sarah, and from wherever you're watching this, buckle up, because what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about family, sacrifice, and the power of hidden truth. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. My father, Colonel James Mitchell, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED took his left leg and most of his hearing. He came home a decorated war hero with a Purple Heart, 2 Bronze Stars, and a spirit that refused to break despite the shrapnel still lodged near his spine. For 32 years, I watched him rebuild his life piece by piece, starting a successful construction company that employed dozens of veterans who couldn't find work elsewhere. He was my hero, my mentor, my everything. Which is why sitting in that leather chair, reading those devastating words felt like being shot point blank in the chest. The reading had taken place on a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Richmond, Virginia, in the law offices of Pemberton, Hayes & Associates. The firm had handled our family's legal matters for over 2 decades, and their senior partner, Mr. William Pemberton, had been Dad's close friend since their college days at Virginia Tech. The office smelled of old books and expensive cologne, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the James River. Under different circumstances, I might have found it comforting. Instead, it felt like a mausoleum. Present in that room were the usual suspects you'd expect at such a gathering. My stepmother, Diana Mitchell, sat across from me in a tailored black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd married my father 8 years ago, after my mother died from cancer, and had spent every day since trying to convince him that his military buddies and I were just waiting to drain his bank account. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her designer purse as Mr. Pemberton read through the document, and I caught the faintest smirk playing at the corners of her glossy lips. Beside Diana sat her son from her previous marriage, Marcus Webb, a 25-year-old who had never worked a day in his life but somehow always had money for the latest gadgets and expensive cars. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked fresh off the rack and kept checking his Rolex every few minutes like he had somewhere more important to be. Marcus had moved into Dad's house the day after the wedding and had spent the last 8 years treating my father's home like his personal ATM. The fact that he was even in this room made my stomach turn. My father's business partner, Roberto Valdez, occupied the chair nearest the window. Roberto had served alongside Dad in Afghanistan and had been his right-hand man in building Mitchell Construction, from a one-truck operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. His weathered hands, scarred from years of military service and construction work, rested on his knees as he listened to the will being read. Roberto's dark eyes kept shifting between Diana and me, and I could see the confusion and anger building behind his usually calm demeanor. The 4th person in the room was my father's longtime friend and fellow veteran, Thomas Crawford. Tom had lost both legs in the same IED explosion that injured my father, but he'd never let that stop him from living life to the fullest. He ran a nonprofit organization that helped homeless veterans find housing and employment, and Dad had been one of his biggest supporters. Tom's wheelchair was positioned near the door, and his knuckles were white as he gripped the armrests, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. Mr. Pemberton, a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, seemed genuinely distressed as he continued reading the will. His voice wavered slightly when he reached the section about the business assets. According to the document, Mitchell Construction, the company my father had built from nothing, the company that employed 37 people and had contracts worth millions, was being left entirely to Diana Mitchell. Every truck, every piece of equipment, every ongoing contract, every penny in the business accounts, she would inherit it all. The will went on to detail how the family home, a beautiful colonial on 12 acres in Hanover County, would also go to Diana, the house where I'd grown up, where my mother had tended her prize-winning rose garden, where Dad and I had spent countless evenings on the back porch talking about everything from military history to my dreams of becoming a teacher. The house where I'd planned to bring my own children someday to hear stories about their grandfather's heroism. All of it, according to this document, now belonged to the woman who had waltzed into our lives and systematically poisoned my father against everyone who truly loved him. But the cruelest part, the section that made my heart feel like it was being crushed in a vice, was the personal message Dad had supposedly left for me. Mr. Pemberton's voice cracked as he read it aloud. To my daughter Sarah, I leave nothing because she has proven herself to be ungrateful for the sacrifices I made and unworthy of the Mitchell family name. She chose her own path and must live with the consequences of her selfish decisions. The words hit me like a physical blow. Ungrateful, unworthy, selfish? This from the man who had taught me the meaning of honor, duty, and sacrifice? The man who had driven 8 hours straight to attend my college graduation, despite being on heavy pain medication after his 3rd back surgery? The man who had walked me down the aisle at my wedding, tears streaming down his face as he told my husband David that he was getting the best woman in Virginia? Diana's smirk had evolved into a full smile by this point, and she reached over to pat Marcus's hand in a gesture that screamed victory. Marcus had stopped checking his watch, and was now leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. Which, I suppose in a way, he now did. The two of them exchanged a look that made my skin crawl, a look that spoke of plans made in secret and schemes executed to perfection. Roberto was the first to break the stunned silence that followed the reading. His voice was rough with emotion as he addressed Mr. Pemberton directly. "Bill, this doesn't make sense. Jim talked about Sarah constantly. He was proud of her teaching career, proud of her marriage, proud of the woman she'd become. Just last month, he was telling me about plans to expand the business so he could leave her a bigger legacy." Tom nodded vigorously from his wheelchair. "Roberto's right. Jim never said a bad word about Sarah. Not once in all the years I've known him. It doesn't sound like the Jim Mitchell we knew." Mr. Pemberton looked genuinely troubled as he adjusted his glasses and reread certain sections of the document. "I understand your concerns, gentlemen, but this will is properly signed, witnessed, and notarized. It was executed just 6 months ago, replacing the previous version. Everything appears to be in order, legally." Diana finally spoke, her voice sickeningly sweet with false sympathy. "I know this is difficult for everyone to accept, but James made his feelings very clear in the months before he passed. Sarah's constant demands for money, her criticism of our marriage, her attempts to turn his friends against me, it all took a toll on him. He felt betrayed by his own daughter. The lie was so bold, so perfectly crafted, that for a moment I was speechless. Demands for money? I had never asked my father for a dime after I graduated college. I had put myself through graduate school, bought my own car, saved for my own house. Criticism of their marriage? I had bent over backward to be polite to Diana, even when she made snide comments about my mother's memory or tried to redecorate the house in a way that erased every trace of my family's history. Marcus decided to pile on to his mother's narrative. Aunt Sarah was always stirring up drama at family gatherings. Dad got tired of dealing with her negativity all the time. The audacity of this 25-year-old calling me negative when he had spent the last 8 years treating my father like a personal bank account was almost laughable. Almost, if it weren't so devastating. I found my voice and stood up, my hands shaking, with a mixture of grief and rage. "This is insane," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Dad and I talked every week. We had lunch together every month. He was planning to take David and me on a fishing trip to Alaska next summer. He was excited about being a grandfather someday. The man who wrote this will is not the father I knew." Diana's expression shifted slightly, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating behind her facade of concern. Grief can make us remember things differently than they actually were, Sarah. James loved you, but he was disappointed in the way you rejected his new family. That was rich, coming from a woman who had spent 8 years trying to isolate my father from everyone who cared about him. I had watched her systematically work to convince him that his military friends were just using him for his money, that his business partner was trying to cheat him, that his daughter was ungrateful and selfish. She had been patient and methodical, like a spider spinning a web, and apparently she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and began gathering the papers on his desk. "I know this is emotionally difficult for everyone involved, but from a legal standpoint, the will is clear and binding. Diana, as the primary beneficiary, you'll need to come in next week to begin the transfer process for the business and property assets. As if on cue, Diana and Marcus rose from their chairs, both of them wearing expressions of barely contained triumph. Diana smoothed her dress and picked up her purse, then turned to address the room one final time. I want everyone to know that I have no hard feelings about the things that were said today. Grief makes people say and do things they don't mean. Sarah, you'll always be welcome in my home. Within reason, of course. The condescending tone in her voice, the implication that my childhood home was now her home, that she might graciously allow me to visit, was the final straw. I felt something inside me snap, a dam breaking after years of pressure. But before I could respond, before I could unleash the torrent of anger and disbelief that was building in my chest, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was the sound of papers rustling from somewhere behind the massive bookshelf that dominated the far wall of the office. Then, clear as day, I heard someone whisper my name. Sarah! The voice was muffled but urgent, coming from what sounded like a hidden room or passage behind the wall of law books. The whisper of my name seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and I watched as everyone in the room froze mid-motion. Diana's hand stopped halfway to the door handle. Marcus's confident swagger faltered, and even Mr. Pemberton looked confused as his eyes darted toward the bookshelf. Roberto and Tom exchanged glances, both of them clearly having heard the same thing I did. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of traffic from the street below and the soft tick of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. "Did anyone else hear that?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His weathered hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests tighter, and I could see the military alertness that never truly left him flickering in his eyes. Roberto nodded slowly, his construction worker instincts making him scan the room for any signs of structural abnormalities or hidden spaces. Mr. Pemberton stood up from behind his desk, looking genuinely puzzled. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. This building is over 100 years old. And sometimes the old pipes or heating system can create strange sounds." But even as he said it, his explanation sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. Diana's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and she shot a quick, nervous glance at Marcus. "We should really be going. There are arrangements to be made, and I have appointments this afternoon." Her voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before, and she seemed suddenly eager to escape the room that had been the scene of her greatest triumph. Marcus was already moving toward the door, his earlier cockiness replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Yeah, Mom's right. We've got that meeting with the insurance company about transferring the policies." The way he said it, quick and rehearsed, made me wonder if they had indeed been planning this moment for much longer than anyone realized. But I couldn't let them leave, not yet. Something about that whispered voice, something about the way it had called my name with such urgency, made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a revelation that could change everything. I took a step toward the bookshelf, scanning its surface for any signs of a hidden door or passage. The books were mostly legal texts and Virginia history volumes, their leather spines worn from decades of use. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Roberto asked, moving to stand beside me. His experience in construction had given him an eye for architectural details that most people missed, and I could see him studying the wall with professional interest. "You thinking there's something back there?" Before I could answer, we heard it again. Not just my name this time, but what sounded like papers shuffling, followed by a muffled voice saying, "The real will. She has to know." The words were barely audible, as if someone was speaking through a thick wall or from a great distance, but they were unmistakably there. Mr. Pemberton's face went from confused to concerned in the span of a heartbeat. He walked around his desk and approached the bookshelf, running his hands along the edges of the wooden panels that surrounded it. "This is impossible. This office shares a wall with the conference room next door, but it's been empty all day, and there's no access between the two rooms." Diana was practically vibrating with nervous energy now, and she grabbed Marcus's arm with enough force to make him wince. "This is ridiculous. We're leaving. Sarah can chase ghost voices all she wants, but I have a business to run now." The words tumbled out of her mouth in a rush, and I noticed a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on her forehead despite the office's cool temperature. "Wait," Tom said, rolling his wheelchair closer to where Roberto and I were examining the bookshelf. "Bill, when was the last time you were in the conference room next door?" His question was pointed, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. Tom had spent years as a military intelligence officer before his injury, and his instincts for detecting deception were still sharp as a razor. Mr. Pemberton paused in his examination of the wall, a frown creasing his features. "Actually, now that you mention it, I haven't been in there since last Friday. My secretary mentioned that someone had requested to use it this morning for document review, but she said it was handled by one of the junior partners." The room fell silent again, except for Diana's increasingly rapid breathing. Marcus had positioned himself near the door like he was ready to bolt at any moment, and his eyes kept darting between his mother and the rest of us with growing panic. Then, as if summoned by our attention, we heard footsteps from beyond the wall. Slow, deliberate footsteps, followed by what sounded like a chair being moved across a hardwood floor. Mr. Pemberton's frown deepened, and he walked to his desk to pick up his phone. "Margaret," he said to his secretary, "who exactly requested the use of conference room B this morning?" There was a pause as he listened to her response, and I watched his face grow increasingly troubled. "No, that's not possible. Mr. Harrison has been in court all day." "Are you certain that's who signed the request form?" Diana made a desperate grab for the door handle, but Roberto's construction worker reflexes were faster. He stepped sideways, blocking her path with his broad frame. "I think we all need to hear what's behind that wall before anyone goes anywhere," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing construction sites and keeping workers in line. "You can't hold us here against our will," Marcus protested, but his voice cracked like a teenager's, undermining any authority he was trying to project. "We haven't done anything wrong. The will is legal, and we're the rightful inheritors." But even as he spoke, we could hear more movement from the adjacent room, and then something that made my heart skip a beat: the sound of a copy machine running. Someone was in that room, copying documents, and given the timing and the whispered mention of the real will, it didn't take a genius to figure out what those documents might be. Mr. Pemberton hung up his phone and looked at all of us with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "Margaret says no one signed out the key to conference room B today. She insists the room has been locked since Friday afternoon." He paused, running a hand through his silver hair. "But she also mentioned that Diana was here last week, ostensibly to discuss funeral arrangements, and asked several questions about our document storage procedures." The accusation hung in the air like a live wire, and Diana's carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely. "That's absurd! I came here to discuss James's final wishes, nothing more. If someone is in that room illegally, it has nothing to do with me." But her protest rang hollow, especially when we heard what came next: the distinctive sound of a paper shredder running. Someone was destroying evidence, and they were doing it right now, just feet away from where we stood. Tom rolled his wheelchair directly in front of the office door, effectively blocking the only exit. His military training had kicked in, and I could see him mentally cataloging every person's position in the room. "Bill, is there another way into that conference room?" "Through the hallway, maybe?" Mr. Pemberton nodded grimly. "Yes, but it's locked, and only the senior partners have keys." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a ring of keys, then paused as if weighing his options. "However, if someone is in there without authorization, destroying documents in my law firm, I have every right to investigate." The shredding sound stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like frantic whispering. Then we heard footsteps again, faster this time, like someone was pacing or searching for something. Diana was now openly panicking, her breath coming in short gasps, and sweat had begun to stain the expensive fabric of her dress. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can't we just handle the will transfer and be done with this? James is gone. Nothing we do now will bring him back." But I was beyond caring about Diana's comfort. The mention of the real will had ignited a spark of hope in my chest, a possibility that the father I knew and loved hadn't actually abandoned me in his final moments. If there was even a chance that this nightmare was based on lies and deception, I had to know the truth. "Mr. Pemberton," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I think we need to see what's in that room, now." He looked at me for a long moment, then at Diana's terrified face, then at Marcus's obvious guilt, and finally at Roberto and Tom's determined expressions. With a decisive nod, he moved toward the door. "I agree. If someone is destroying documents in my law firm, I need to know about it immediately." As he reached for the door handle, we heard one final sound from the adjacent room, a door slamming, followed by rapid footsteps receding down the hallway. Whoever had been in there was making their escape, but hopefully not before we could discover what they had been trying to hide. Diana made one last desperate attempt to control the situation. "This is harassment. I'm calling my lawyer." But her threat sounded weak and pathetic, especially since we were already in a law firm surrounded by lawyers. Mr. Pemberton paused with his hand on the door. "Diana, if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear from us investigating strange sounds in my own building." His tone had shifted from confused to stern, and I could see the lawyer in him taking over from the family friend. "However, if you'd like to explain why you seem so eager to prevent us from checking an allegedly empty room, I'm all ears." The challenge hung in the air between them, and I could see Diana's mind racing as she tried to calculate her options. Marcus had gone completely white and was now leaning against the wall for support, looking like he might faint at any moment. That's when we heard my name whispered again, but this time it was coming from the hallway outside the office. "Sarah, the truth. Find the truth." The voice was clearer now, more urgent, and it seemed to be moving away from us down the corridor. Mr. Pemberton didn't wait for anyone's permission this time. He yanked open the office door and stepped into the hallway, with the rest of us following close behind. The corridor was empty, but I could smell something that hadn't been there when we arrived. The distinct odor of burning paper and the ozone scent that copy machines leave in the air when they've been running hard. Conference Room B was just 3 doors down from Mr. Pemberton's office, and as we approached it I could see that the door was slightly ajar. Through the gap I could make out papers scattered across the conference table, and what looked like the remnants of documents in a trash can beside an industrial paper shredder. Mr. Pemberton pushed the door open fully, and we all crowded into the doorway to see what had been left behind. The room looked like a tornado had blown through it. File folders were scattered across the large wooden table. A copy machine in the corner was still warm to the touch, and the paper shredder was filled with the confetti remains of destroyed documents. But it was what we found on the table that made my knees weak and my heart race with a mixture of hope and rage. There, partially hidden under a stack of other papers, was a document with my father's letterhead. The heading read, "Last Will and Testament of James Robert Mitchell," but the date on this version was different from the one we had just heard read in Mr. Pemberton's office. This one was dated just 2 weeks before my father's death, making it more recent than the will that had left me nothing. And there, in my father's familiar handwriting, was a note clipped to the front page, "For Sarah, my greatest pride and joy. Everything I built for you." The note in my father's handwriting hit me like a physical blow, but this time it was hope rather than despair that knocked the wind from my lungs. I reached for the document with trembling fingers, barely able to process what I was seeing. The paper felt real, substantial, not like some cruel mirage that would disappear the moment I touched it. Roberto moved to stand behind me, his presence solid and reassuring as I lifted the will from the table. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered from his wheelchair, rolling closer to get a better look. "Sarah, that's definitely your dad's writing. I've seen enough of his reports and work orders to recognize it anywhere." His voice carried a mixture of vindication and fury, the tone of a man who had just discovered that his friend's memory had been deliberately poisoned. Mr. Pemberton stepped forward, his professional instincts overriding his shock. "May I see that, please?" His voice was carefully controlled, but I could see his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the document. Behind us, Diana had gone completely silent, her face ashen and her breathing so shallow I wondered if she might hyperventilate. As I handed the will to Mr. Pemberton, I caught sight of Diana in my peripheral vision. She was backing slowly toward the door, her designer purse clutched against her chest like a shield. Marcus had positioned himself behind her, and both of them looked like deer caught in headlights, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Where do you think you're going?" Roberto's voice cut through the tension like a blade. His construction worker build and military bearing made him an imposing figure when he wanted to be, and right now he wanted to be very imposing indeed. "I think we all need to stick around and figure out what the hell is going on here." Mr. Pemberton was scanning the document quickly, his eyes moving back and forth across the pages, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had read thousands of legal documents. His frown deepened with each paragraph, and I could see his jaw tightening as he processed what he was reading. "This is impossible," he muttered, flipping to the second page. "This will is completely different from the one I read this morning. According to this document, Sarah inherits the house, the business, and the majority of James's assets. Diana is provided with a modest trust fund, but—" He looked up at Diana with an expression of growing suspicion. "But you're not the primary beneficiary." Diana's laugh was high-pitched and hysterical. "That's obviously a fake. Someone planted it here to make me look bad. Sarah probably had it made up because she couldn't accept her father's real wishes." But even as she spoke, her voice lacked conviction, and her eyes kept darting toward the door like a trapped animal looking for escape. "Mom, we should call our lawyer," Marcus whispered urgently, tugging at Diana's sleeve. "We shouldn't say anything else without representation." His suggestion only made him look more guilty, and I could see Mr. Pemberton filing away every word for future reference. Tom rolled his wheelchair to block their path more effectively. "Funny how you want a lawyer now, when 5 minutes ago you were perfectly happy to walk out with millions of dollars based on a will that apparently isn't legitimate." His voice carried the cold authority of someone who had interrogated enemy combatants, and I could see both Diana and Marcus flinch under his gaze. Mr. Pemberton continued reading, his expression growing more troubled by the moment. "The signatures appear authentic, the witnesses are properly listed, and the notarization looks legitimate. More importantly, the handwritten notes in the margins are definitely James's writing. I've seen enough of his documents over the years to be certain of that." He looked up at Diana again, and this time his expression was purely professional, with no trace of the family friend who had greeted us earlier. "Diana, I need to ask you directly, did you know about the existence of this will? Because if you did, and you allowed me to proceed with reading what you knew to be an outdated or fraudulent document, you could be facing serious criminal charges." Diana's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: fear, anger, calculation, and finally, a desperate kind of defiance. "I don't know anything about that document. For all we know, it was created after James died. People forge wills all the time when they don't like what their loved ones actually left them." But her protest was undermined by what happened next. As Mr. Pemberton turned to the final page of the will, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Roberto bent to pick it up, and when he read it, his face went dark with rage. "It's a receipt," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "From a document disposal service. Dated last Tuesday." He held up the paper so we could all see it. "Same day as James's funeral. Someone paid to have legal documents shredded." The receipt was made out to D. Mitchell for confidential document destruction services, and it included a detailed list of materials that had been destroyed. Various wills, trust documents, and estate planning materials. The smoking gun we needed to prove that Diana had known about multiple versions of my father's will. Diana's face went from pale to gray, and she grabbed onto Marcus's arm for support. That's not mine. Someone must have forged that too." But her voice was barely audible, and even Marcus was looking at her with something approaching horror. Mr. Pemberton carefully placed the receipt on the conference table and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police. Document destruction during probate proceedings is a serious crime, especially when it involves suppressing legitimate wills." His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, and I could hear the faint sound of a phone ringing on the other end. "Wait!" Diana's voice cracked like a whip, and for the first time since I'd known her, the mask of perfect composure slipped completely. "You don't understand. James, he wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. The medications, the pain, he was changing his will constantly. I was just trying to protect his real intentions." Roberto snorted in disgust. "Protect his intentions? You mean protect your bank account? He gestured toward the scattered papers on the table. How many versions of that will you destroy, Diana? How many times did Jim try to make sure his daughter was taken care of? Tom was studying the receipt with the focused intensity he'd once brought to analyzing enemy intelligence. This service receipt lists multiple pickup dates going back 6 months. You weren't just destroying documents after he died, you were doing it while he was still alive. The implications of that revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. Diana hadn't just hidden my father's final wishes. She had been systematically destroying his attempts to provide for me throughout the last months of his life. Every time he'd tried to update his will to ensure I was protected, she had found a way to make those documents disappear. Mr. Pemberton finished his call to the police and turned back to face Diana with the expression of a prosecutor who had just found the key piece of evidence in a murder case. The police are on their way, along with a forensic document examiner. We're going to need to examine every piece of paper in this room, and I'm going to need explanations for how you accessed my law firm's conference room without authorization. Diana looked around the room desperately, her eyes moving from face to face, searching for any sign of sympathy or support. Finding none, she seemed to deflate, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her deception finally became too much to bear. "You don't know what it was like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, watching him give away everything to people who didn't appreciate it. Sarah never visited enough, never called enough. She took him for granted. The accusation was so far from the truth that I felt my temper flare. I talked to him every week. I visited every month. I was planning to move back to Richmond so I could help take care of him as he got older. My voice rose with each word, years of suppressed frustration, finally finding an outlet. "That's not true," Marcus interjected, but his defense of his mother sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Dad always said you were too busy with your own life to care about family." Tom wheeled his chair around to face Marcus directly. "Son, your stepfather talked about Sarah constantly. Every time I saw him, he had some story about her students, or her husband, or something funny she'd said during their last phone call. The only time I ever heard him sound disappointed was when he talked about you spending his money faster than he could make it." The brutal honesty of Tom's words hit Marcus like a physical blow, and I could see him processing the implications. If Dad had really been proud of me and disappointed in Marcus, then everything Diana had told them about the family dynamics had been a lie. Mr. Pemberton was methodically gathering the scattered papers from the conference table, placing each document in a separate folder for the police to examine. "Diana, you and Marcus are going to need to remain here until the authorities arrive. Attempting to leave now would only make things worse for both of you." As if summoned by his words, we heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by voices and what sounded like radio chatter. The police had arrived faster than I'd expected, which probably meant Mr. Pemberton carried more weight in the legal community than I'd realized. Diana made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Sarah, please, think about what this will do to the family reputation. Your father wouldn't have wanted his dirty laundry aired in public. We can work something out privately, share the inheritance, and avoid a scandal." But her plea fell on deaf ears. After what I'd discovered, after seeing the receipt that proved she'd been systematically destroying my father's attempts to provide for me, I felt no sympathy for her situation. "The only thing Dad wouldn't have wanted," I said, my voice cold and steady, "was for his daughter to be cheated out of her inheritance by someone he trusted." The first police officer appeared in the doorway, a tall woman with sharp eyes, and the no-nonsense bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with complicated family disputes. Behind her came a younger officer carrying what looked like evidence collection equipment, and bringing up the rear was a man in a suit who introduced himself as Detective Rodriguez from the Fraud Division. Mr. Pemberton stepped forward to greet them, his professional demeanor helping to establish the gravity of the situation. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. We have what appears to be a case of document fraud and suppression of a legitimate will." As the police began to take statements and examine the evidence, I found myself standing near the window, looking out at the James River flowing peacefully below. The last few hours had been an emotional roller coaster that left me feeling drained and overwhelmed, but underneath the exhaustion was a growing sense of vindication. Roberto moved to stand beside me, his presence comforting in its steadiness. "Your dad would be proud of you," he said quietly. "Standing up for the truth, not letting them get away with it. That takes guts." From across the room, I could hear Diana giving her statement to Detective Rodriguez, her voice shaky as she tried to explain away the evidence mounting against her. Marcus sat in a chair near the door, his head in his hands, looking like he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what his mother had done. But it was what I heard next that made my heart skip a beat. From somewhere in the hallway, barely audible over the conversations and radio chatter, I heard someone whisper my name again. "Sarah, there's more. Check the safe." The whispered words about a safe sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the conference room. I turned away from the window, scanning the faces of everyone present to see if anyone else had heard it. Roberto was still standing beside me, but his attention was focused on Detective Rodriguez, who was questioning Diana with the methodical precision of someone who had dealt with similar cases before. Tom was positioned near the door, effectively blocking any escape route, while Mr. Pemberton organized documents for the police to examine. None of them seemed to have heard the whisper, which made me wonder if I was losing my mind from the stress of the day. But the voice had been so clear, so urgent, and the mention of a safe felt significant in a way I couldn't ignore. My father had always been meticulous about important documents, and it would make sense for him to have additional protections in place for his most crucial papers. Detective Rodriguez was a sharp-eyed man in his 40s, with graying temples and the patient demeanor of someone who had seen every type of family dispute imaginable. He was taking Diana's statement with professional skepticism, occasionally asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to catch inconsistencies in her story. Diana, for her part, was sticking to her claim that she had no knowledge of any additional wills, and that the document we'd found must be a forgery. "Mrs. Mitchell," Detective Rodriguez said, consulting his notes, "you mentioned that your husband changed his will frequently, due to medication and pain. Can you provide me with the names of any witnesses to these alleged changes?" His tone was neutral, but I could hear the trap being set. Diana shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands twisting the strap of her designer purse. "Well, I mean, he would work on them privately. He was very secretive about his legal affairs." The answer was weak, and I could see the detective filing it away as another inconsistency. Marcus had remained largely silent during the questioning, but I could see him glancing nervously between his mother and the evidence spread across the conference table. The receipt for document destruction services was particularly damaging, especially since it was made out in Diana's name and dated for the day of Dad's funeral. Mr. Pemberton approached Detective Rodriguez with a concerned expression. "Detective, I need to mention something that might be relevant to your investigation. James Mitchell maintained a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, and he also had a personal safe in his home office. If there were additional legal documents, those would be the most likely places to find them." The mention of a safe made my pulse quicken. That had to be what the whispered voice was referring to. Dad had indeed kept a large safe in his home office, hidden behind a panel that looked like built-in bookshelves. He'd shown it to me years ago when I was in college, explaining that it contained important family documents, military records, and other irreplaceable items. Diana's face went white when Mr. Pemberton mentioned the safe. "That's impossible," she said quickly. "James never used that old thing. He said the combination was lost years ago." But her protest sounded desperate, and I could see Detective Rodriguez making another note in his file. "Actually," I interjected, drawing everyone's attention, "Dad showed me that safe when I was in college. He said he kept his most important documents there, including copies of his military records and Mom's jewelry." I looked directly at Diana as I spoke. "He told me the combination was Mom's birthday, something he'd never forget." The silence that followed my statement was deafening. Diana's breathing became shallow and rapid, while Marcus looked like he might be sick. Even Mr. Pemberton seemed surprised by this revelation, and I could see him mentally cataloging all the implications. Detective Rodriguez closed his notebook and stood up. "I think we need to examine that safe immediately. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to need you and your son to accompany us to the house so we can conduct a proper search of the premises." It wasn't a request. Diana tried one last desperate maneuver. You can't just search my home without a warrant. I have rights." But her voice lacked conviction, and she seemed to know she was grasping at straws. "Actually," Detective Rodriguez replied calmly, "given the evidence of document destruction and potential fraud, I can obtain a warrant within the hour. However, if you cooperate voluntarily, it would certainly be viewed favorably by the district attorney's office." The implicit threat was clear: cooperate now or face additional charges later. Mr. Pemberton gathered the documents we'd found and placed them in a secure briefcase. "I'll need to accompany you to ensure the integrity of any legal documents we might find. As the attorney of record for James Mitchell's estate, I have a responsibility to protect his legitimate final wishes." As we prepared to leave the law office, I caught Roberto's eye and gestured for him to stay close. Something told me we were going to need all the allies we could get for whatever we might discover at Dad's house. Tom was already maneuvering his wheelchair toward the elevator, his military instincts telling him that this operation was far from over. The drive to Dad's house in Hanover County took about 30 minutes, with Detective Rodriguez leading the way in his unmarked police car, followed by Mr. Pemberton in his Mercedes, and Roberto driving Tom and me in his pickup truck. Diana and Marcus rode with the detective, both of them looking like prisoners being transported to their execution. The house looked exactly as I remembered it from Dad's funeral reception just a week ago, but somehow it felt different now. The colonial facade with its white columns and wraparound porch had always represented stability and family tradition to me, but now it felt tainted by the knowledge of Diana's deception. The rose garden that Mom had loved so much was beginning to show signs of neglect, with weeds growing between the carefully planned beds. Diana used her key to let us into the house, her hands shaking so badly that it took her 3 tries to get the door open. The interior was exactly as Dad had left it, with his reading glasses still on the side table next to his favorite recliner, and yesterday's newspaper folded neatly on the coffee table. The familiarity of it all hit me like a wave, and I had to take a deep breath to keep my emotions in check. Detective Rodriguez was all business as he surveyed the living room. "Where is this safe located, Miss Mitchell?" he asked, pulling out his notebook again. I could see him documenting everything for his report, treating this as seriously as any other criminal investigation. "It's in Dad's office, behind the bookshelf on the far wall," I replied, leading the way down the familiar hallway. The office had always been Dad's sanctuary, with its military memorabilia, photographs from his construction projects, and the massive oak desk where he'd conducted business for decades. The bookshelf in question was built into the wall and looked like a permanent architectural feature, but I remembered Dad showing me how the entire middle section swung out on hidden hinges to reveal the safe behind it. As we approached it, I could see Diana hanging back, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. Roberto ran his hands along the edges of the bookshelf with the practiced touch of someone who understood construction and hidden mechanisms. "There's definitely something here," he said, pressing against what looked like decorative molding. With a soft click, the middle section of the bookshelf swung outward to reveal a large, modern safe with an electronic keypad. The safe was much more sophisticated than I'd remembered from my college years. Dad had obviously upgraded it at some point, installing what looked like a biometric scanner alongside the traditional combination lock. The digital display showed that it was armed and secure, waiting for the proper authentication. "The combination should be Mom's birthday," I said, moving toward the keypad. "August 15th, 1958, 81558. But as I reached for the keypad, Diana suddenly lurched forward. "Don't!" she screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "You don't understand! If you open that safe, it will ruin everything." Her admission that she knew what was inside was as good as a confession, and I could see Detective Rodriguez making rapid notes. Tom rolled his wheelchair closer to Diana, his expression grim. "What exactly are you afraid we're going to find in there, Diana? More wills that you thought you'd destroyed? Evidence of how you manipulated a dying man?" Diana's response was to collapse into Dad's desk chair, sobbing hysterically. "He was going to leave me with nothing," she wailed. "After everything I did for him, all the care I provided, he was going to throw me out like garbage and give everything to an ungrateful daughter who barely visited." The lies continued even in her moment of breakdown, and I felt my anger flare again. I visited every month. I called every week. The only reason I didn't come more often was because you made it clear I wasn't welcome in my own childhood home. Marcus, who had been silent throughout our journey to the house, finally spoke up. "Mom, what did you do? What's in that safe?" His voice was small and frightened, like a child who was finally beginning to understand that his parents had done something terrible. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to need you to stop interfering with this investigation. If you continue to obstruct our search, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." The threat was delivered in a calm, professional tone that somehow made it more intimidating than if he'd been shouting. I turned back to the safe and carefully entered Mom's birthday on the keypad. The display beeped softly and prompted me for biometric verification. For a moment, I panicked, thinking that Dad's fingerprints would be required. But then I remembered him mentioning that he'd programmed multiple users into the system for emergencies. "Try your thumb," Mr. Pemberton suggested. James was always practical about these things. If he wanted you to have access to this safe, he would have made sure you could open it. I pressed my thumb against the scanner, half expecting it to reject me and end our investigation before it really began. But after a moment that felt like an eternity, the scanner beeped twice, and the heavy door swung open with a soft mechanical hum. Inside the safe was a treasure trove of documents, jewelry, and other valuable items. But what caught my attention immediately was a manila envelope sitting prominently on the top shelf, with my name written across it in Dad's unmistakable handwriting. Below that was another envelope marked, "For the authorities, evidence of fraud and manipulation." As I reached for the envelope with my name on it, Diana let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. "Please," she begged, "don't read that." He wasn't himself when he wrote it. The pain medication made him paranoid and suspicious. He started imagining things that weren't true. But her pleas only made me more determined to discover what Dad had wanted me to know. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and found several pages of handwritten notes, along with what appeared to be photocopies of multiple versions of his will. The first page was a letter addressed to me personally, and as I began to read it, I felt my father's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside me. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that my suspicions about Diana were correct, and she has tried to cheat you out of your inheritance. I want you to know that every decision I made in my final months was made with love for you and determination to protect what we built together." As I continued reading, the scope of Diana's deception became clear, and I realized that we had only begun to scratch the surface of her manipulation and fraud. But it was what I heard next that made my blood run cold. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, followed by someone whispering my name from what sounded like the kitchen at the back of the house. The whisper from the kitchen made everyone in the office freeze, and I could see Detective Rodriguez's hand instinctively move toward his service weapon. The footsteps were deliberate and measured, not the panicked scrambling of someone trying to escape, but rather the confident stride of someone who belonged in the house. Diana's face went from desperate to terrified, and Marcus actually whimpered like a frightened child. "Police! Identify yourself!" Detective Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the authority of years of law enforcement experience. The footsteps stopped immediately, followed by a moment of silence that stretched on long enough to make everyone nervous. Then, to my complete amazement, a familiar voice called back from the kitchen. "It's okay, Detective. It's Michael Patterson, James Mitchell's CPA. I have a key to the house, and I've been waiting for someone to finally discover what Diana has been hiding." Mr. Pemberton's eyebrows shot up in recognition. "Michael, what in God's name are you doing here? And how did you know we'd be coming to the house?" His confusion was evident, but there was also relief in his voice at discovering the identity of our mysterious visitor. Michael Patterson appeared in the doorway of Dad's office, looking haggard and worn but determined. He was a slight man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and I remembered him from various business meetings over the years. Dad had trusted him implicitly with the company's finances and his personal investments. "I've been trying to reach someone about this for weeks," Michael said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Ever since James died, Diana has been systematically looting his accounts and trying to transfer assets into her name. When I tried to object, she threatened to sue me for interfering with her rightful inheritance. Diana shot up from Dad's chair like she'd been electrocuted. That's a lie. Michael has been embezzling from the company for years. James was planning to fire him before he died. Her accusations sounded desperate and hollow, especially given everything else we'd discovered. Michael reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. I have bank records, wire transfer receipts, and correspondence that prove exactly what Diana has been doing. She's moved over $200,000 from James's personal accounts into accounts controlled by her and Marcus. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward to examine the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page he reviewed. Mr. Patterson, these are some very serious allegations. Can you walk me through exactly what you discovered? As Michael began his explanation, I continued reading Dad's letter, and with each paragraph, my understanding of Diana's deception grew deeper and more disturbing. According to Dad's notes, he had become suspicious of Diana's behavior several months before his death, when he noticed discrepancies in his financial statements. He had started keeping detailed records of her activities and had even hired a private investigator to document her actions. Sarah, the letter continued, I know this will be difficult to read, but Diana has been stealing from me for over a year. She convinced me to give her power of attorney for my medical decisions, then used that authority to access my financial accounts. The private investigator I hired discovered that she and Marcus have been planning to take everything from the moment she married me. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Dad had known what Diana was doing, had been documenting her theft and manipulation, but had died before he could fully protect himself and me from her schemes. The guilt I felt was overwhelming. If only I had visited more often, if only I had paid closer attention to the warning signs, maybe I could have helped him sooner. Roberto was reading over my shoulder, his face growing darker with each revelation. That evil witch, he muttered under his breath. Jim knew exactly what she was doing, and she probably killed him with the stress of it all. Tom rolled his wheelchair closer to where Michael was showing Detective Rodriguez the financial records. Michael, how long has this been going on? When did you first notice something was wrong? Michael adjusted his glasses nervously before answering. The first red flag was about 8 months ago, when Diana started asking detailed questions about James's investment accounts and retirement funds. She claimed she needed the information for estate planning purposes, but something about her tone didn't sit right with me. He pulled out another set of documents from his briefcase. Then, about 6 months ago, I started seeing unusual transactions. Large cash withdrawals, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, changes to beneficiary information on various policies. When I questioned James about them, he told me Diana was handling his finances because his medication made it difficult for him to concentrate. Diana was pacing frantically now, her earlier composure completely shattered. This is all lies and speculation. James gave me permission to manage his affairs because he trusted me. Everything I did was with his full knowledge and consent. But Michael wasn't finished. That might have been true initially, but James came to see me about 3 weeks before he died. He was lucid, off his pain medication for the day, and he was furious about what he'd discovered. He told me Diana had been forging his signature on financial documents and had changed his will without his knowledge. The room fell silent except for the sound of Diana's increasingly labored breathing. Detective Rodriguez was taking rapid notes, and I could see him building a case that went far beyond simple will fraud. This was looking more and more like elder abuse and grand theft. Mr. Pemberton had been quietly examining the contents of the safe while Michael gave his testimony, and now he emerged with several additional documents that made the scope of the deception even clearer. There are multiple versions of James's will in here, he announced, along with what appears to be a detailed timeline of Diana's fraudulent activities. He held up a bound notebook filled with Dad's handwriting. James documented everything: dates, times, amounts stolen, forged signatures, even recorded conversations with Diana, where she admitted to taking money without permission. This isn't just estate fraud, this is a comprehensive criminal enterprise. Marcus had slumped against the wall and was staring at his mother with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "Mom, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me we didn't steal from a dying man." His voice was barely above a whisper, and I could see the moment when he finally understood the magnitude of what his mother had done. Diana's response was to turn on her son with vicious fury. "Don't you dare judge me. Everything I did was for us, for our future. That man owed me for the years I spent taking care of him, dealing with his pain and his nightmares, and his constant talk about his precious daughter, who couldn't be bothered to come home." The attack on my character was the final straw for Roberto, who stepped forward with barely controlled rage. "Lady, you are one sick piece of work. Jim talked about Sarah constantly because he loved her, not because she neglected him, and you repaid his love by robbing him blind while he was dying." Detective Rodriguez intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. "Mrs. Mitchell, based on the evidence we've uncovered today, I'm placing you under arrest for elder abuse, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud." He began reading her Miranda rights while pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The sight of Diana being arrested should have felt like victory, but instead I felt hollow and exhausted. Dad had died, knowing that the woman he'd trusted had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and that knowledge must have been devastating for a man who had always believed in the goodness of people. Michael approached me with another folder from his briefcase. "Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Your father set up a trust fund for you that Diana never knew about. It contains the majority of his liquid assets, nearly $500,000 that she never had access to." The financial relief was welcome, but it paled in comparison to the emotional validation of knowing that Dad had been thinking of me and protecting my interests, even while dealing with Diana's betrayal. The trust fund was proof that his love for me had never wavered, despite whatever lies Diana had been telling him. As Detective Rodriguez finished arresting Diana, a second police officer arrived to escort Marcus to the station for questioning. The young man looked broken, like someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his life was a lie. Part of me felt sorry for him, but a larger part was angry that he had benefited from stolen money while Dad suffered in silence. Mr. Pemberton was methodically photographing and cataloging every document from the safe, ensuring that all evidence would be properly preserved for the legal proceedings to come. "Sarah, we're going to need to start probate proceedings over again from the beginning, using your father's legitimate final will. It's going to take some time to sort everything out, but I'm confident we can restore your rightful inheritance." Tom was examining Dad's notebook, reading through the detailed accounts of Diana's theft and manipulation. "Your father was a smart man, Sarah. He knew exactly what was happening and made sure there would be evidence to prove it. He protected you even when he couldn't protect himself." As the police finished their work and began removing evidence from the house, I found myself standing in Dad's office, surrounded by the remnants of his life and the proof of his love for me. The military photos on the walls, the awards and commendations, the pictures of our family from happier times, all of it spoke to the man he had been and the legacy he had tried to leave for me. Michael was packing up his documents when he turned to me with a sad smile. "Your father was one of the best men I ever knew, Sarah. What Diana did to him was unconscionable, but she never broke his spirit. Right up until the end, he was fighting to make sure you were taken care of." The validation meant everything to me, but it also made the loss feel fresh and raw again. Dad had died fighting a battle I hadn't even known was being waged, protecting me from a threat I hadn't recognized. The guilt of not being there when he needed me most was almost overwhelming. Roberto seemed to sense my emotional state and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Jim wouldn't want you blaming yourself for this, Sarah. Diana was a professional manipulator who spent years planning this scheme. There's no way you could have known what was happening from a distance." As we prepared to leave the house, I heard one final whisper from somewhere in the back of the house. This time, the voice was clearer and more familiar than before, and it spoke words that made my heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. "Sarah, the basement. She didn't find everything. There's more." The basement had always been Dad's workshop and storage area, filled with tools, military memorabilia, and boxes of family documents. If there was more evidence hidden down there, evidence that Diana hadn't discovered during her systematic looting of Dad's estate. It could be the key to understanding the full scope of her crimes. Detective Rodriguez was just finishing his preliminary report when I approached him about searching the basement. "Detective, I think there might be additional evidence in my father's workshop downstairs. He always kept important documents in multiple locations as a backup." The detective's interest was immediately piqued. "Show me," he said simply, and I led the way down the narrow stairs to the basement that held so many childhood memories. The basement stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the dimly lit workshop that had been Dad's sanctuary for as long as I could remember. The familiar smell of sawdust, machine oil, and old leather filled my nostrils, bringing back memories of countless afternoons spent watching him work on various projects while he told me stories about his military service. Detective Rodriguez followed close behind me, his flashlight cutting through the shadows cast by the single overhead bulb. The workshop was exactly as Dad had left it, with hand tools hanging in precise order on pegboard walls and larger equipment covered with canvas tarps. His workbench was still cluttered with the remnants of his last project, a jewelry box he'd been making for my upcoming birthday, though I'd never had the chance to see it finished. The sight of the half-completed gift made my throat tighten with emotion, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. Roberto and Tom had followed us downstairs, along with Mr. Pemberton, who was documenting everything with his phone camera. Michael Patterson remained upstairs, gathering additional financial records from Dad's desk to provide to the authorities. The basement felt crowded with all of us present, but everyone seemed to understand the importance of being thorough in our search. "Where would your father have hidden additional documents?" Detective Rodriguez asked, sweeping his flashlight across the various storage areas. The basement was larger than it appeared from the stairs, extending under the entire footprint of the house, with multiple rooms dedicated to different purposes. I closed my eyes and tried to think like Dad would have thought. He'd been a military man who understood the importance of redundancy and security. If he had backup documents that even Diana didn't know about, they would be hidden in a place that was both secure and meaningful to our family history. "There's a storage room behind the furnace," I said, leading the way past the workshop area toward the mechanical room. "Dad used to keep Mom's things back there after she died. Photo albums, her jewelry, personal items he couldn't bear to have in the main house but couldn't bring himself to get rid of." The storage room was accessed through a narrow doorway that was partially concealed behind the old oil furnace. Dad had installed additional shelving units back there over the years, and the space had become a repository for family memorabilia dating back decades. Boxes were stacked floor to ceiling, each one carefully labeled in Dad's neat handwriting. Detective Rodriguez squeezed through the doorway and began examining the labels on the boxes. "Military records, family photos, Helen's belongings," he read aloud, working his way through the stacks. "Wait, here's something interesting. A box labeled Legal Backup, 2024. My heart skipped a beat as the detective carefully lifted the box from its position high on a shelf. It was heavier than expected, and when he set it down on Dad's workbench and opened it, we could see why. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each one meticulously organized and labeled with dates and subjects. Mr. Pemberton stepped forward to examine the contents, his professional training helping him quickly identify the significance of what we'd found. These appeared to be photocopies of every legal document James created or signed in the last year of his life, he said, pulling out folder after folder. Bank statements, investment records, insurance policies, multiple versions of his will. But it was Tom who made the most significant discovery. "Look at this," he said, holding up a small digital recording device that had been hidden in the bottom of the box. "It's a voice recorder, and it looks like it's been used recently." Detective Rodriguez carefully took the device and pressed the play button. Dad's voice filled the basement, weak but determined, speaking what sounded like a detailed confession about Diana's crimes. The recording was dated just 1 week before his death, and it provided a first-hand account of the theft and manipulation he'd endured. "This is James Mitchell speaking on March 15, 2024, Dad's voice began. "I'm making this recording because I believe my wife Diana is trying to kill me, and I want there to be evidence of what she's done if something happens to me." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grab onto the workbench for support. Roberto moved to steady me while the recording continued, each word more damning than the last. Diana has been systematically poisoning me with my own medication, Dad's voice continued. She's been increasing the dosages without telling my doctors, making me confused and disoriented so I can't think clearly about my financial affairs. She thinks I don't know what she's doing, but I've been pretending to take the pills and hiding them instead. Detective Rodriguez was taking rapid notes while the recording played, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. This wasn't just a state fraud anymore. This was potential attempted murder, and it changed the entire scope of the investigation. Tom was staring at the recording device with the intensity of someone who was hearing his worst fears confirmed. I knew something was wrong, he muttered. Jim started acting strange in his last few months, forgetting conversations we'd had, seeming confused about things he'd always been sharp about. I thought it was just the pain medication, but... She was drugging him, Roberto finished, his voice tight with rage. That evil woman was slowly poisoning him to death while she stole everything he'd worked for. The recording continued with Dad detailing specific instances of Diana's theft and manipulation. He described how she'd forged his signature on financial documents, how she'd convinced his doctors to increase his pain medication dosages, and how she'd systematically isolated him from his friends and business associates. "I've documented everything in the files hidden in this box," Dad's voice explained. Bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals, photographs of documents Diana thought she'd destroyed, even video recordings of her going through my safe when she thought I was unconscious from the medication. Mr. Pemberton looked up sharply at the mention of video recordings. "Are there security cameras in this house?" he asked, already knowing that such evidence could be crucial to building a case against Diana. I nodded, pointing toward a small camera mounted in the corner of the basement ceiling. Dad installed a security system about 2 years ago. He said it was for protection against burglars, but maybe he had other reasons. The implications were staggering. If Dad had been recording Diana's activities, there could be video evidence of her crimes. Detective Rodriguez was already on his radio, calling for a technical team to examine the house's security system. "We need to secure all electronic devices and storage media," he told his dispatcher. "This has escalated to a potential homicide investigation." The word homicide hung in the air like a dark cloud, making the reality of the situation painfully clear. Diana hadn't just stolen from Dad, she had been slowly killing him while she looted his estate. The cruelty of it was beyond comprehension, and I felt a rage building inside me that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Tom was examining more folders from the box, and his face was growing paler with each document he reviewed. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, holding up a medical report. "This is from your father's doctor, dated 2 weeks before he died. It shows toxic levels of several medications in his blood, levels that would have been lethal if they'd continued to increase." The medical evidence was the final piece of the puzzle, proving that Diana's actions weren't just theft but attempted murder. Dad had died of what everyone thought was natural causes related to his war injuries. But the truth was far more sinister. Diana had been systematically poisoning him while stealing his money and rewriting his will. Detective Rodriguez finished his radio call and turned back to us with a grim expression. "I've requested a full forensic team and a warrant to search every inch of this property. We're also going to need to exhume James Mitchell's body for a full toxicology examination." The thought of Dad's body being disturbed was painful, but I knew it was necessary to prove what Diana had done to him. He deserved justice, and the only way to get it was to uncover the full truth about his death. Michael Patterson appeared at the top of the basement stairs, calling down to us with urgency in his voice. "Detective Rodriguez, you need to come up here immediately. I've found something in James's computer files that you need to see." We all trooped back upstairs to Dad's office, where Michael had his laptop connected to Dad's desktop computer. On the screen was a folder labeled Insurance Policy that contained dozens of files documenting Diana's activities. James had been conducting his own investigation for months, Michael explained, clicking through the files. He hired a private investigator, installed hidden cameras throughout the house, and even recorded phone conversations where Diana discussed her plans with Marcus. One of the audio files was particularly damning. It was a conversation between Diana and Marcus from just 3 weeks before Dad's death, where they discussed how to accelerate his deterioration and gain access to his remaining assets. "The old fool is getting suspicious," Diana's voice could be heard saying. "We need to increase the medication again and make sure he signs the new will before he figures out what we're doing." Marcus's response was equally damning. "What if he dies before we can get everything transferred? We need to make sure we have legal control over all his assets." "Don't worry," Diana replied. "I've already forged his signature on the power of attorney documents. Even if he dies tomorrow, I'll have complete control over his estate." Detective Rodriguez was practically vibrating with anger as he listened to the recording. These two were planning his murder while discussing how to steal his money. "This is one of the most cold-blooded cases I've ever encountered." As if summoned by our discovery, we heard the sound of police sirens approaching the house. The forensic team had arrived, along with additional detectives and what looked like the entire investigative unit. Diana's simple estate fraud had exploded into a complex murder investigation that would require extensive resources to properly prosecute. Mr. Pemberton was still examining documents from the basement box when he made another significant discovery. "There's a letter here addressed to the district attorney's office," he said, holding up an envelope with Dad's handwriting. "It appears James was planning to file formal charges against Diana before he died." The letter detailed Dad's suspicions about Diana's criminal activities and requested a full investigation into her handling of his financial affairs. He had been preparing to expose her crimes when she accelerated her poisoning schedule, killing him before he could bring her to justice. Roberto was pacing the office like a caged animal, his rage at Diana's betrayal evident in every movement. Jim trusted that woman with his life, and she used that trust to murder him. She deserves to rot in prison for what she did. Tom nodded grimly from his wheelchair. "What gets me is how calculated it all was. She didn't just kill him in a moment of passion. She planned it out for months, stealing his money while slowly poisoning him to death." As the forensic team began their work throughout the house, I found myself thinking about Dad's final weeks and wondering how much pain and confusion he'd endured while fighting Diana's schemes. The knowledge that he'd died knowing he was being betrayed by someone he loved made his loss even more devastating. But it was what I heard next that made my blood run cold and changed everything we thought we knew about the case. From somewhere upstairs, barely audible over the activity of the forensic team, I heard a voice whispering urgently, "Sarah, the attic. She hid the murder weapon. Find the syringe." The implications of those words hit me like a thunderbolt. If Diana had been poisoning Dad with injections rather than just pills, there would be physical evidence of her crime. And if she'd been foolish enough to hide that evidence in the house rather than disposing of it properly, we might have the smoking gun that would put her away for life. The whispered words about a syringe in the attic sent a chill through my entire body, and I found myself looking up at the ceiling as if I could see through the plaster and wood to whatever Diana might have hidden above us. The attic had always been a storage space for seasonal decorations and old furniture, but now it represented something far more sinister, potentially the hiding place for evidence of my father's murder. Detective Rodriguez noticed my upward gaze and the change in my expression. "What is it, Miss Mitchell? Did you hear something?" His tone was sharp and alert, the voice of someone who had learned to pay attention to even the smallest details in a criminal investigation. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should mention the whispered voices that had been guiding us throughout this nightmare. They had led us to every major piece of evidence so far, but explaining mysterious voices to a police detective seemed like a good way to undermine my credibility. Instead, I focused on the practical aspects of what we might find. "The attic," I said simply. If Diana was hiding evidence somewhere in this house, the attic would be the perfect place. Dad rarely went up there because of his back problems, and it's full of boxes and old furniture where something small could easily be concealed. Detective Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. If she was administering drugs through injection, she'd need to dispose of the syringes somewhere, and hiding them rather than throwing them away would be consistent with someone who's paranoid about leaving evidence in the trash." Mr. Pemberton looked up from the documents he'd been examining. "The access to the attic is through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, James had it installed when they moved into the house so Helen could store her holiday decorations up there. The mention of Mom's decorations brought back memories of helping her carry boxes up and down that ladder every Christmas and Easter, back when our family was whole and happy. The thought that Diana might have corrupted that space with evidence of Dad's murder felt like yet another violation of our family's memory. Roberto was already heading toward the hallway. "I'll go up and take a look. My knees are still good and I know what to look for." His construction background made him the logical choice for navigating the cramped attic space, and his military training would help him conduct a thorough search. "Actually," Detective Rodriguez interjected, "I need to go first. This is a potential crime scene, and we need to maintain the chain of evidence." He called one of the forensic technicians who had just arrived. "Lopez, bring your camera and evidence kit. We're going to search the attic." As Detective Rodriguez pulled down the folding ladder and climbed into the attic, I could hear him moving around above us, his footsteps muffled by the insulation and flooring. The forensic technician followed him up with a powerful flashlight and camera equipment, their voices echoing down through the opening. "There's a lot of stuff up here," Detective Rodriguez called down. "Christmas decorations, old furniture, boxes of papers. Wait, what's this?" The excitement in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt my heart start racing with anticipation. "I've got something," he continued. "There's a small metal box hidden behind a stack of Christmas storage containers. It's locked, but it's not very heavy." The sound of evidence bags rustling came from above, followed by more careful movements as the detective documented the discovery. Tom rolled his wheelchair to a position directly under the attic opening. "Can you describe the box? What does it look like?" His investigative instincts were sharp, and I could see him mentally cataloging every detail for later analysis. "It's about the size of a cigar box, made of brushed aluminum with a small combination lock," Detective Rodriguez replied. "It's been placed very deliberately behind the decorations, not just tossed up here randomly. Someone wanted this hidden but accessible." The detective and technician spent another 20 minutes carefully searching the attic, documenting everything with photographs, and collecting several additional items that looked suspicious. When they finally climbed back down, Detective Rodriguez was carrying multiple evidence bags, including the mysterious metal box. "We found quite a bit up there," he announced, setting the bags on Dad's desk. In addition to this locked box, there were several plastic bags containing what appeared to be used syringes, empty medication vials, and some handwritten notes. Mr. Pemberton leaned forward to examine the evidence bags without touching them. "Those look like insulin syringes, but James wasn't diabetic. What would Diana need with insulin injection equipment?" Michael Patterson, who had been quietly reviewing financial records, looked up with a grim expression. "Insulin can be lethal if injected into someone who doesn't need it. It causes the blood sugar to drop to dangerous levels, mimicking the symptoms of natural illness or medication side effects." The pieces of Diana's murder method were falling into place with horrifying clarity. She hadn't just been increasing Dad's regular medications. She'd been injecting him with insulin to create episodes of confusion and weakness that would mask her theft and make his eventual death appear natural. Detective Rodriguez was examining the handwritten notes through the clear evidence bag. These appear to be dosage calculations and timing schedules. Someone was very methodical about planning these injections. He looked up at all of us with an expression of disgust. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a carefully planned murder carried out over months. Tom was studying the evidence with the intensity of someone who had seen too much violence in his lifetime. The beautiful thing about insulin poisoning is that it's almost impossible to detect unless you know to look for it. Most doctors would assume the symptoms were related to James's existing medical conditions. Roberto's hands were clenched into fists as he processed what we discovered. She was torturing him, making him sick and confused while she stole his money, then slowly killing him when he started to figure out what she was doing. The forensic technician had brought a small toolkit with him, and Detective Rodriguez decided to attempt opening the locked metal box immediately, rather than waiting to get it back to the police station. "Sometimes these small combination locks can be easily defeated," he explained, pulling out a set of thin metal picks. It took him less than 5 minutes to manipulate the lock mechanism, and when the box clicked open, the contents made everyone in the room gasp. Inside were dozens of insulin vials, some empty and some still full, along with a detailed logbook documenting injection dates, dosages, and Dad's reactions to each dose. "My God," Mr. Pemberton whispered, reading the logbook entries over the detective's shoulder. She documented everything: dates, times, dosages, even notes about how James responded to each injection. The logbook was written in Diana's distinctive handwriting, and it read like a scientist's research notes rather than the diary of a grieving wife. Each entry was clinical and detached, describing Dad's deterioration with the cold objectivity of someone conducting an experiment. March 1st. Increased insulin dose to 15 units. The subject became confused and disoriented within 2 hours. Perfect cover for financial transaction modifications. March 8th. Subject becoming suspicious of medical treatments. Increased dose to 20 units and convinced him it was a new diabetes prevention medication. March 15th. Subject discovered some financial discrepancies. Time to accelerate the timeline. Will increase to 25 units daily until completion. The final entry was dated just 2 days before Dad's death. March 20th. Subject rallying and threatening to contact authorities. The final dose of 40 units should complete the process within 48 hours. Detective Rodriguez closed the logbook and carefully placed it back in the evidence bag. This is a complete confession. Diana Mitchell documented her father's murder in her own handwriting, including her motive and methods. Michael was shaking his head in disbelief as he reviewed his financial records. The correlation between the injection dates and the financial transactions is perfect. Every time James became incapacitated from the insulin, Diana would access his accounts and transfer more money. The systematic nature of Diana's crimes was staggering. She hadn't just stolen Dad's money and killed him. She'd turned his final months into a living hell of confusion and sickness, while she methodically looted his estate. The cruelty of it was beyond comprehension. As Detective Rodriguez organized the evidence for transport to the police station, his radio crackled with an update from the officers who had arrested Diana and Marcus. "Rodriguez, this is Sergeant Williams. The suspects are in custody, but the mother is demanding to speak with you immediately. She says she has information about additional crimes that weren't discovered yet." The detective looked up from his evidence bags with raised eyebrows. "Additional crimes? What else could there be?" But even as he asked the question, I could see the wheels turning in his head. If Diana had been capable of slowly murdering her husband while stealing his money, what other horrors might she have committed? "Tell Sergeant Williams I'll be there within the hour," Detective Rodriguez replied into his radio, "and make sure both suspects are properly separated and monitored. I don't want them coordinating their stories." Mr. Pemberton was organizing the legal documents we discovered, preparing to file emergency motions to freeze all of Diana's assets and begin the process of recovering Dad's stolen money. "Sarah, we're going to need to move quickly on the financial recovery. If Diana has been stealing for months, she may have hidden assets in accounts we haven't discovered yet." As the forensic team finished their work and began packing up their equipment, I found myself standing in Dad's office, surrounded by the evidence of his murder and the proof of his love for me. The contrast was overwhelming. The clinical documentation of Diana's crimes juxtaposed against Dad's handwritten notes expressing his pride in my accomplishments and his determination to protect my inheritance. Tom rolled his wheelchair over to where I was standing. "Your father would be proud of how you handled this," he said quietly. "You didn't give up when the first will didn't make sense, and you fought to uncover the truth even when it was painful." Roberto nodded in agreement. "Jim always said you had a stubborn streak. He'd be glad to know that stubbornness helped bring his killer to justice." But as we prepared to leave the house and head to the police station to observe Diana's interrogation, I heard the mysterious voice one final time. It was clearer than ever before, and the words it spoke made my blood freeze. "Sarah, the basement. Check the furnace. She burned more than just papers." The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. If Diana had been burning evidence in the basement furnace, there might be additional proof of her crimes that we hadn't discovered yet. More importantly, if she'd burned other documents or materials, it suggested that her criminal activities might have extended beyond just Dad's murder. Detective Rodriguez was already heading toward the front door when I called out to him. "Detective, wait. I think we need to check the basement furnace. If Diana was burning evidence, there might be ash residue that could be analyzed. The detective paused and turned back with interest. That's a good point. Even burned materials can sometimes yield forensic evidence. He called the forensic technician who was packing up his equipment. Lopez, we need to examine the basement furnace before we leave. As we headed back down to the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something that would make Diana's crimes even more horrific than we'd already discovered. The voice that had been guiding us throughout this investigation had never led us astray, and its urgency about the furnace suggested that whatever we found there would be significant. The old oil furnace dominated one corner of the basement, its cast iron bulk radiating heat even though the spring weather didn't require heating. Detective Rodriguez opened the access panel and peered inside with his flashlight, immediately noticing something that made him call for additional equipment. There are definitely burn residues in here that don't look like normal heating oil combustion, he announced. I can see bits of unburned paper and what looks like melted plastic or rubber. The forensic technician brought down a specialized vacuum and collection kit designed for gathering trace evidence from fire scenes. As he carefully collected samples from inside the furnace, Detective Rodriguez continued his examination of the surrounding area. There's something else here, the detective said, reaching behind the furnace to retrieve what looked like a partially melted container. It appears to be some kind of medical waste disposal box, the kind used for disposing of used syringes and medication vials. The discovery of medical waste in the furnace was the final confirmation of Diana's systematic disposal of evidence. She had been burning not just documents but also the physical evidence of Dad's murder, trying to eliminate any trace of her crimes. But as Detective Rodriguez continued his examination of the furnace area, he made one more discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about the scope of Diana's crimes. A partially burned photograph that showed Diana with an elderly man I didn't recognize, along with what appeared to be a death certificate dated several years before she'd married my father. The partially burned photograph trembled in Detective Rodriguez's gloved hands as he held it up to the basement's overhead light. The image was damaged by heat and smoke, but still clear enough to make out Diana's unmistakable features alongside an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair. What made the discovery truly chilling was the death certificate fragment that had been burned along with the photo, showing a date that preceded Diana's marriage to my father by 3 years. Lopez, get this photographed immediately, Detective Rodriguez instructed the forensic technician. And I want every piece of ash and debris from this furnace collected and analyzed. We may be looking at evidence of multiple homicides here. The words multiple homicides echoed in the basement like a death knell, and I felt my knees go weak as the implications sank in. If Diana had killed before, if my father wasn't her first victim, then her marriage to him had been part of a calculated pattern of murder for financial gain. She was a serial killer who had been perfecting her methods on vulnerable elderly men. Mr. Pemberton was studying the burned photograph with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. The man in this photo appears to be wearing a wedding ring, and Diana is dressed in what looks like formal attire. This could be from another marriage, one that we never knew about. Tom rolled his wheelchair closer to examine the evidence, his military intelligence background helping him analyze the significance of what we'd found. If Diana was married to this man before she married James, and he died under suspicious circumstances, then we're dealing with a black widow killer, someone who makes a career out of marrying wealthy older men and murdering them for their money. Roberto's face had gone pale as he processed the discovery. Jesus Christ! How many people has this woman killed? How many families has she destroyed? His voice was rough with emotion, and I could see him struggling to control his rage at the scope of Diana's crimes. Detective Rodriguez was already on his radio, calling for additional resources and requesting a nationwide search of death records for elderly men who had died under suspicious circumstances while married to women matching Diana's description. We need to run her fingerprints through every database we have access to. If she's done this before, there will be a trail. As the forensic team worked to collect every possible piece of evidence from the furnace area, Michael Patterson approached me with a grim expression. Sarah, I've been thinking about some unusual financial transactions I noticed in your father's accounts. Large deposits that came in about 6 months after he married Diana. Deposits that didn't match any of his known income sources. The implications of Michael's observation hit me immediately. You think she brought money from her previous victim into Dad's accounts? The thought that Dad's own money might have been contaminated with the proceeds from Diana's earlier murders made me feel physically sick. It's possible, Michael replied, pulling out his laptop to show me the financial records. There were 3 separate deposits totaling nearly $200,000, all coming from what appeared to be estate settlements or insurance payouts. At the time, James told me Diana had inherited the money from a deceased relative, but now… Detective Rodriguez looked up from his examination of the furnace. Mr. Patterson, I'm going to need copies of all those financial records. If Diana was using proceeds from previous murders to establish herself in your father's life, that money represents evidence of her prior crimes. As we continued to uncover the scope of Diana's criminal enterprise, I found myself thinking about all the times she had been alone in the house with Dad, all the opportunities she'd had to search through his belongings and plan her systematic theft. The knowledge that she had been operating from a playbook developed through previous murders made her betrayal even more horrific. Mr. Pemberton was organizing the legal documents we'd discovered, but his expression was troubled. Sarah, we're going to need to examine every aspect of Diana's background before her marriage to your father. If she has a history of this type of crime, there may be other families who never got justice for their loved ones. The responsibility of potentially helping other victims' families find closure was overwhelming, but I knew it was something Dad would have wanted. He had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Exposing Diana's full criminal history would be his final act of service to others. As Detective Rodriguez prepared to head back to the police station for Diana's interrogation, his radio crackled with an urgent message from Sergeant Williams. Rodriguez, you need to get back here immediately. The suspect is claiming she has information about a missing person case from 5 years ago. She says she'll only talk if she can make a deal. The detective's expression darkened as he processed this new development. A missing person case? What the hell else has this woman done? He turned to address all of us. I need everyone to remain available for additional questioning. This investigation is expanding beyond anything we initially imagined. Tom was studying the burned photograph with a magnifying glass that Lopez had provided. There's something else here, he announced, pointing to what appeared to be a building in the background of the image. This looks like it was taken in front of a church or wedding venue. If we can identify the location, we might be able to trace Diana's previous marriage. Roberto moved to look over Tom's shoulder. That architecture looks familiar. The stonework in those windows. I think that might be St. Mary's Cathedral downtown. They do a lot of weddings for older couples. The possibility of identifying Diana's previous marriage location was exciting, but it also raised questions about how many other crimes we might uncover. If she had been operating for years, systematically murdering elderly men for their money, the scope of her criminal enterprise could be staggering. Mr. Pemberton closed his briefcase and prepared to accompany Detective Rodriguez to the police station. Sarah, I'm going to observe Diana's interrogation if the detective will allow it. As your father's attorney, I have a legitimate interest in understanding the full scope of her crimes against his estate. As the group prepared to leave Dad's house, I took one final look around the basement workshop where we'd made so many crucial discoveries. The familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil was now forever tainted by the knowledge of what Diana had hidden here, but it was also the place where we'd found the evidence that would bring her to justice. Michael was packing up his financial records when he made one final observation that sent chills down my spine. Sarah, I just realized something. The timing of Diana's large deposits corresponds exactly with obituaries I found in the Richmond newspaper for elderly men who died under suspicious circumstances. 3 different men, all within the past 5 years, all survived by wives who disappeared shortly after the funerals. The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a picture of Diana as a sophisticated criminal who had been perfecting her methods for years before she'd targeted my father. She wasn't just a greedy woman who had been tempted by Dad's wealth. She was a professional killer who had made murder her career. Detective Rodriguez was gathering the last of the evidence when his phone buzzed with a text message. His expression grew even more serious as he read it. The preliminary fingerprint analysis came back. Diana Mitchell has been using multiple identities over the past decade. The FBI wants to talk to her about several cold cases involving wealthy elderly men who died under suspicious circumstances. The revelation that Diana was already on the FBI's radar suggested that law enforcement had been tracking her activities for some time, possibly waiting for enough evidence to build a solid case. Dad's murder and our discovery of her evidence cache might be the break they needed to solve multiple cold cases. As we finally left the house and headed toward our cars, I heard the mysterious voice one final time, but this time, instead of directing us toward more evidence, it spoke words of comfort and closure. "Sarah, he's proud of you. Justice will be served. Rest now." The voice faded away, leaving me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt since Dad's death. Whatever supernatural force had been guiding us through this investigation seemed satisfied that we had uncovered the truth and set the wheels of justice in motion. The drive to the police station was somber, with each of us lost in our own thoughts about the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Diana's crimes went far beyond simple estate fraud. She was apparently a serial killer who had been targeting vulnerable elderly men for years, perfecting her methods with each victim. When we arrived at the police station, Detective Rodriguez led us to an observation room where we could watch Diana's interrogation through a one-way mirror. She sat at a metal table in the interview room, still wearing the expensive black dress she'd worn to the will reading, but her perfect composure had completely cracked. Her makeup was smeared, her hair disheveled, and her hands shook as she clutched a cup of coffee. Across from her sat an FBI agent who had arrived while we were searching the house. Agent Sarah Chen was a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the patient demeanor of someone who specialized in interviewing serial killers. She had Diana's complete criminal file spread across the table, including photographs and documents that made Diana's face grow paler with each revelation. "Mrs. Mitchell, or should I say Mrs. Patterson, or perhaps Mrs. Caldwell," Agent Chen began, using what were apparently Diana's previously assumed identities. "We've been tracking your activities for quite some time. The deaths of Harold Patterson in 2019, Robert Caldwell in 2021, and now James Mitchell in 2024 show a clear pattern of behavior." Diana's response was barely audible, but we could see her lips moving as she tried to formulate some kind of defense. The weight of evidence against her was overwhelming, and even someone as manipulative as Diana seemed to realize that her criminal career had finally come to an end. Agent Chen continued her methodical presentation of the evidence, detailing each of Diana's previous marriages and the suspicious deaths that had followed. The pattern was consistent. She would target wealthy widowers, marry them after a brief courtship, then systematically steal their money while slowly poisoning them to death. "The insulin injection method you used on James Mitchell matches the cause of death we suspected in the Patterson and Caldwell cases," Agent Chen explained. "We just never had the physical evidence to prove it until now." As the interrogation continued, Diana finally broke down and began confessing to details of her crimes that even we hadn't suspected. She described how she had researched potential victims through obituaries and social clubs, how she had developed fake identities to hide her criminal history, and how she had perfected her murder methods to avoid detection by medical examiners. The scope of her confession was staggering. Over the course of 8 years, Diana had murdered at least 5 elderly men, stealing millions of dollars in the process. Dad hadn't just been her latest victim. He had been part of a killing spree that had robbed multiple families of their loved ones and their inheritances. As Agent Chen concluded the interrogation and Diana was led away to her cell, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. Justice would be served, Dad's real will would be honored, and other families would finally have answers about their own losses. But the knowledge that Dad had suffered so much in his final months, that he had died knowing he was being betrayed by someone he loved, would stay with me forever. Detective Rodriguez joined us in the observation room as the interrogation concluded. Based on her confession and the evidence we've collected, Diana Mitchell will be facing multiple charges of first-degree murder, elder abuse, fraud, and racketeering. She'll never see the outside of a prison again. Mr. Pemberton placed a comforting hand on my shoulder as we prepared to leave the police station. "Sarah, your father's courage in documenting Diana's crimes not only ensured that justice would be served in his case, but it also provided the evidence needed to solve multiple other murders. His final act was helping other families find closure." As we walked out of the police station into the evening air, I realized that the nightmare was finally over. Dad's true will would be probated, his real wishes would be honored, and Diana would spend the rest of her life paying for her crimes. The whispered voices that had guided us to the truth had gone silent, their mission accomplished. The next morning, I woke up in my own home for the first time in days, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since Dad's death. The phone was already ringing with calls from reporters who had gotten wind of the story, but I wasn't ready to talk to the media yet. There would be time for that later, time to tell the world about Diana's crimes and warn other families about predators who target vulnerable elderly people. For now, I just wanted to remember Dad as he really was. A hero who had served his country with honor, built a successful business that employed dozens of people, and loved his daughter enough to fight for her inheritance even while he was being murdered. Diana had stolen his money and his life, but she couldn't steal his legacy or the love he had shown me throughout my life. The will said $0 for his daughter, but the lawyer had found the pages they missed. Pages that revealed not just Dad's true wishes, but the depths of one woman's evil and the lengths a father would go to protect his child. In the end, truth had prevailed, and justice would be served. 6 months later, I stood in the courtroom as the judge sentenced Diana Mitchell to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of 5 elderly men, including my beloved father. Marcus received 15 years for his role in the conspiracy. The gavel's final bang echoed through the packed courtroom, bringing closure not just to me but to 4 other families who had finally learned the truth about their loved ones' deaths. Dad's construction company thrived under my management, continuing his legacy of employing veterans who needed a second chance. The trust fund he'd hidden allowed me to expand the business and establish the James Mitchell Foundation, providing support for families of elderly abuse victims. But the most profound change was personal. Standing in Dad's rebuilt office, now clear of Diana's poison, I felt his presence in every military photo, every award, every tool he'd left behind. The mysterious voices that had guided us to justice never returned, but I didn't need them anymore. Dad's love lived on in the legacy he'd fought so hard to protect. The basement workshop became a memorial space where I'd bring my future children to hear stories about their grandfather's heroism, both in war and in his final battle against evil. Diana thought she could erase our family's history, but she only made it stronger. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most powerful revelations about love, courage, and the lengths a parent will go to protect their child. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share your own experiences with family challenges in the comments below. You never know who might need to hear that they're not alone. Together, we can support each other through life's most difficult moments and ensure that love always triumphs over deception. Remember, trust your instincts, question what doesn't feel right, and never stop fighting for the truth.